All right, thank you. I've gotten the thumbs up to get us started. A couple announcements first. One, of course, to make sure you're all in the right space, especially if you're all waiting in line outside for so long. Welcome to the Bay Area Book Festival session on castles, canals, and freeways, historical mysteries in the 20th century. And if we're all leaning too far back from the mic or in too close and hurting your ears, just kind of wave frantically and we'll figure it out. First reminder, of course, please silence your phones and any other devices you may have, watches, tablets, whatever. After the program, books will be sold in a tent in the park, the South Salito Books by the Bay tent. And everyone here will be, I know it sounds a lot when you say it out loud.
Just give me the cash, don't worry about it, I get you the book.
And everyone will be there to sign copies of their books. Of course, also, please join us in thanking the Mystery Writers of America, the NorCal division, for their generous sponsorship. They're a terrific group, and they've really helped make this whole event possible. Brian Cliff, the moderator, I'm going to introduce everyone and then try to get out of the way, and we'll get right into the discussion. We got a slightly late start. We're still going to end on time, so we're not holding all the other panels up through the day. We'll leave about 15 minutes for questions at the end, I think, so if you come up with something, make sure to hold on to it. As for me, I grew up in Detroit and I now live in Berkeley, but I'm still affiliated with Trinity College Dublin, where I taught for 9 years. I published 2 books on Irish crime fiction, including Guilt Rules All, co-edited with Elizabeth Mannion, which was shortlisted for an Edgar Award last year in the biographical critical category. Cara Black, at the end there, is a best-selling author of 20 books in the P.I. Aimée Leduc series, set in Paris, including the most recent series entry, Murder at the Porte de Versailles, published earlier this spring. And I feel like this is where I should apologize for having erred and taken German instead of French at college. So whatever I butcher over the next 45 minutes, blame it on my German professor. In 2020, Cara also published a standalone historical thriller, 3 Hours in Paris, about an attempt to assassinate Hitler in June of 1940. Her novels have been nominated for numerous prizes, and she's received the Paris City Medal for her cultural contributions. Rhys Bowen, in the middle here, is a best-selling author of over 40 novels, including last year's The Venice Sketchbook, which was shortlisted for Best Novel of 2021 by the Edgar Awards, and her most recent novel, Wild Irish Rose, which is the 18th in her Molly Murphy mystery series. Originally from Bath, she's also lived in California and Australia, but has been a long-time part resident of California, lived in Germany and Australia, but has been a long-time part-time resident of California. Her works won 20 awards, and she's been translated into 22 languages, and I'm guessing counting.
Yeah, no, 30 actually by now.
30 now?
Yeah.
Ah. What was the 30th?
Estonian, maybe?
Okay, all right, there you go. That's what I was going to guess.
Yeah.
Third generation San Francisco resident, Laurie R. King, to my left here, was recently named the 2022 Grand Master by the Mystery Writers of America.
You're here.
Her most recent book is her 17th novel, featuring the protagonist Mary Russell, who met the retired Sherlock Holmes in 1915, worked with him, and then became his partner. She's also written the Stuyvesant and Gray series, set between the wars, 5 novels featuring the San Francisco homicide inspector, Kate Martinelli, and 5 standalone novels. Gary Phillips has been a community activist, labor organizer, and deliverer of dog cages. He's published 14 novels, numerous collaborative works, short story collections, and 12 graphic novels. He's also edited 10 anthologies, most recently, I think, The Obama Inheritance, 15 stories of conspiracy noir. His 1994 novel, Violent Spring, part of his Ivan Monk series, was named one of the essential crime novels of Los Angeles. And his current novel is One Shot Harry, out earlier this spring from Soho Press. And since today's focus is on historical crime fiction, I've asked the panelists to start by reading a brief passage from their work that highlights the kind of historical detail they're particularly pleased to get into the book, and talk a little bit about why that detail, how they found it. So maybe if we could start with you, Laurie.
I just realized I don't have my reading glasses on. So you don't mind reading this, do you? When you have, Rhys and I were saying, it's always difficult because you fill your books with all these just prime little tidbits, but they're always part of the plot. And so it's always a question of something that, that you can really grow with, or that does something that you yourself as a writer like. And I think that what I decided on was the very first of the Russell and Holmes series, The Beekeeper's Apprentice, because I love the way that as a historical writer, I get to layer things. Because to my people in the teens and 20s, this is the present. On the face of things, it would have been extremely unlikely for a proper gentleman such as Holmes to take on a young woman as pupil, much less apprentice her to his arcane trade. 20 years before, with Victoria on the throne, an alliance such as Holmes and I forged, close, under-chaperoned, and not even rendered safe by the bonds of blood, would have been unthinkable. This was, however, 1915. During the war, the very fabric of English society was picked apart and rewoven. Necessity dictated that women work outside the home. And so, women put on boots and took control of trams and breweries, factories and fields. Upper-class women signed on for long stretches nursing in the mud and gore of France, or, for a lark, put on smocks and gaiters and became land girls during the harvest. The harsh demands of king and country and the constant anxieties over their fighting men reduced the rules of chaperonage to a minimum. People simply had no energy to spare for the proprieties.
And can I ask, before we move on, what was it about that particular passage that you really wanted the readers to get, or that you wanted to contribute to the
Well, I wanted, as I said, the idea that we are reading this in, it was published in 1994, so we're reading it now. We're looking back at it from the point of view of the author, who is an old woman when she's writing it, but she is seeing society from both her own eyes in 1915 to 1917, and from her later eyes, where she sees what is in the process of happening. So there's a lot of places where you drop in things that are a part of the background, such as the war, such as the land girls. They're not worth going into because it's not a plot point, but they're there to give dimension to the time and place.
Terrific. Rhys?
Yeah. Well, this book is about Venice, and the interesting thing is that all of my descriptions in 1928 are really applicable now. So I'm going to read you a tiny short description scene and then go to a little dialogue scene. At last, Aunt Hortensia and I have arrived in Venice after a long, sweaty, smoking, and exceedingly uncomfortable train journey. Aunt Hortensia does not believe in wasting money and declared that sleeping berths on train ride are completely useless, as the cars stop, start, and shake so much that sleep is impossible. So we sat up all the way from Boulogne on the French coast, through France, then Switzerland, and into Italy. By day it was awfully hot. One could not open the windows as smoke and cinders would blow in from the engine. And during the night there was a man opposite who snored loudly, as well as his wife, who stank of garlic and body odor. I knew I shouldn't be complaining. I was fully aware of how awfully lucky I was at being taken to Italy for my 18th birthday. The girls in my form at school were most envious. All that is behind us now. We are here. We came out of the Santa Lucia train station and stood at the top of a flight of steps. Ecco il canale grande, Aunt Hortensia said in dramatic fashion, spreading out her arms as if this was a stage and she had created the scene for my benefit. My Italian was limited to please, thank you, and good day, but I understood it was the Grand Canal, only it didn't look very grand. It was wide, to be sure, but the buildings on the other side were rather ordinary, and they looked dirty too. The odor that greeted my nostrils was not particularly appetizing. It was a watery sort of smell with a hint of fish and decay. I didn't have much chance to study on my surroundings, however, because we were immediately besieged by porters. It was a little alarming to have men fighting in a strange language, snatching our bags and trying to bundle us into a gondola, whether we wanted to or not. But as Aunt Hortensia confessed, we had no alternative. I want to skip a little bit ahead to a scene of dialogue. My characters, this is now 1939, and my character's the main protagonist and the man who becomes her love interest. Where are we? You are enjoying our city and your academy. Both are wonderful, thank you. What are you doing in this neighborhood? I live nearby. I regretted the words as soon as I said them. I saw the reaction in his eyes. Really? Which street? I'm not going to tell you, or you'll come and visit me and we'll both get into trouble. All right, but not on this street, I take it. No. You know what it's called, don't you? No, I don't. It was grinning. It's Terroria de Assassini. Terroria. That means a former river that's been turned into a street. And Assassini sounds like assassins. Exactly, you're right. It's the Street of Assassins. Goodness, I looked up alarmed. Assassins have their own street in Venice? Of course. How else would one find one when one needed one? I checked to see if he was joking. He was quite serious. Not today, surely. I examined the quiet surroundings, the peeling shutters closed against the midday heat, the ubiquitous pigeons sitting on porches. He gave a little shrug. But what about the police? I'm sure they need assassins too from time to time. So that was actually said to me once in Venice, so it still goes on.
Which part of that was actually said to you?
The Street of Assassins. You know what it's called, and you know if you need one.
And so were you saying there that something about part of the appeal of setting the novel in Venice and setting it between kind of two time frames was that it kind of hadn't changed?
It's immortal, yeah. I mean, that's the thing, is so much of Venice is exactly as it was. The things like, the little things you notice, like people who live on the third and fourth floor with a canal. A boat comes up, they lower down a basket, the morning paper and the milk and the bread are put into it, and the basket goes up again. That still happens now. So, when you're doing research in Venice, it's wonderful because so little has changed.
And because you're in Venice.
Yeah, and one of the reasons I started to write this book was that there's a biennale, the 2-yearly art festival in the gardens. And when I was there, I saw the program, and I went down, and I saw it had been held in 1940 and 1942. And I thought, that's the middle of World War II. Who went? You can't have an international art festival when the world is at war. But the fact was, in Venice, it mattered so much to them that they still hold it.
No, that wasn't me. Gary, if you don't mind.
That was the assassin. I'm going to read a quick passage
There's
here
a balcony and everything.
from One Shot Harry. And it's set in L.A. in '63. Harry's a crime photographer, but he's also a Korean War vet. Soon the barman returned with his drinks, and Ingram drank slowly, realizing there was tension in his shoulders, a residue of an encounter with a cop today. There were black cops on the force, but why the hell was it the white ones were always the ones he seemed to encounter? Surely sitting here in a bar with luck in its name, some of that had to rub off on him, didn't it? He sniffed, having more of his rum and coke, relaxing some. Hey, G.I., you lonely tonight? Ingram had been staring at a napkin with the bar's name on it. Now his head jerked up. Who said that? He glared at men and women, couples, and those sitting by themselves. Little Eva was singing Locomotion on the juke. But that woman's voice. He wheeled back around on his stool and chalked it up to his nerves. The welcome alcohol warmed his insides. He had more, already considering another round. I know you're cold out there. Ingram bolted off his stool, nearly knocking it over. Hey, man, the customer next to him. I don't know. Hey, man, the customer next to him blared. God damn, that was Soul City Sue.
And could you maybe, for anyone who hasn't read the novel yet, but will be buying it shortly, could you say something about Soul City Sue?
Yeah, Soul City Sue was an actual person akin to Tokyo Rose and Axis Sally in World War II, and then later would be Hanoi Hannah in Vietnam. She was a woman who had a pleasant voice, dare I say, a sexy voice, and you would hear her broadcast from the north, that is to say from North Korea, over the radio, or sometimes they would play her records over the PA system, or play her radio over the PA system, from the enemy lines to the Allied lines. And of course, her job is to undercut the morale of the soldier. So she would tell them, hey GI, your wives and girlfriends back home have already found somebody else, and so on and so on. But then she would stop her patter, her propaganda patter, and then play, a record, right? Play Little Eva's Locomotion, or play whatever the record was, in that time period, 53, 55, from America. And as it turned out, interesting enough, Soul City Sue was a white woman from Arkansas. So there you go.
There's a lot of soul in Arkansas.
Was she ever arrested?
Yes, ma'am. No, actually she didn't. She stayed in the North.
Oh, okay.
She stayed in the North.
Well, I bet she's having a fun time.
And Cara?
So this happens in Paris in November in the wake of 9/11. So I'm just going to go in the middle of this story and just pick something here. Tuesday evening after hours reception at the Musée Bourdelle. Is that me? Okay. Aimée had once visited Musée Bourdelle on a school trip. It had seemed ancient then. The 19th century sculptor Antoine Bourdelle resided and worked here in a quiet warren of crooked streets alongside the Montparnasse station. Then a cheap place to live, the area held small industry manufacturing, ironmongers, blacksmiths, and commercial draft horse stables. Even now, Bourdelle's atelier evoked the past, as though he'd just stepped out to smoke his pipe in the middle of his bronze casting. His atelier, untouched, as his widow decreed, was lit by bright shafts coming through old, tall windows facing a garden furnished with his statues. The atelier's chipped gray plaster walls and sepia tones seemed like an old photo coming to life. The herringbone wooden floor creaked at her step. A stand nearby held a bust in progress. The patina of age lay over everything. She could practically smell a century of dust. The old charcoal stove with its funny angled flue pipe reminded her of her grandmother's farm kitchen in Auvergne. She wished she could spend a minute here, but her destination lay beyond. She needed to get to that photo exhibit and locate her target. Soft ambient music drifted as she walked into the courtyard, swirling with aqua indigo light over age-blackened pillars and dried-out hydrangea bushes. Inside, a set of Belle Epoque rooms, she expected to find les bobos, bourgeois bohemians, left-bank art types mingling with the aristo chic. She hoped she dressed right and wouldn't attract attention. She joined the crowd under the plasterwork curlicues along the edges of the ceilings and gilded mirrors. The vernissage was a grand opening reception, showcasing black and white photos of civil disobedience, street demonstrations, protests in the 70s and 80s. Demonstrations with bell-bottomed protesters and hovering tear gas. Just the usual acts of destruction and resulting chaos, said a woman of a certain age. Revolution and business continue, no different today. Her long white blonde hair was a 70s look that stood in contrast with the woman next to her, whose geometric punk pink hair screamed the 80s. Both seemed slightly déclassé to Aimée, wannabe rebels. In fact, much of the crowd, men and women with ironed jeans and skin-tight leather jackets and snakeskin boots, shared this vibe. It seemed her target mingled with radicals who were still celebrating their greatest hits decades later.
Seems an appropriate line to end with in Berkeley. And if I can ask, what your most recent novel before this was historical, set in 1940, which was a bit of a departure for you, and then you moved back to something that's still, we were talking about this a little bit last night, and as a teacher, even when I would teach a novel set, say, during the Troubles or in the wake of the Troubles in Northern Ireland, for my students, that's a historical novel. That's not in their lived experience, even though it's a very contemporary novel for the author or for me. And I think the same kind of applies to the 2001 setting. But was there something about that moment that drew you to do the next thing after the 1940 novel?
This book, you mean?
Yeah.
Well, I had a contract. Always a very... well, I wanted to write, I've been writing about the different arrondissements in Paris, and I hadn't written about the 15th, so I wrote about, set the story there. And it's a place you've probably been through. You just don't stay there. There's no monuments. It's very residential. And when you say to a Parisian, where do you live? I live in the 15th. Ron, it's where you go when you settle down and there's better schools and all. But this one museum, I had been here over the years, I loved it. And it really is like the sculptor just stepped out. It's been left like that. And I think what Laurie was saying about, it's through Aimée Leduc's eyes in the wake of 9/11. So we're seeing it, and she's looking at the past generation of, 70s and 80s radicals. And so I thought that was interesting, the past and the most recent past and the present.
Yeah,
I hope that came across. But
yeah, it did. I think all four novels, interestingly, are set at these kind of very transitional moments or kind of hinge moments to whether or not that's, to varying degrees explicit or central to the plot of the story. And actually, this is one question for all four of you, whether it's sort of Venice between the wars or Paris at any time, or Sherlock Holmes or Los Angeles in the 60s. You've all taken on these settings and these historical moments that some readers, maybe especially for you, Laurie, will have very protective notions about how those moments and characters not only should be, but are. And how has that been to navigate readers' expectations, both for the genre, because people bring fairly specific expectations, and for these moments and settings?
I noticed one thing when everybody was reading, apart from Gary, all of us are in the first person. And I think that is, if you're seeing anything through a character's eyes, you've brought it to life. It's not, I think none of us want to say, I'm going to tell you how it was at this time. They're going to say, I'm going to take you to this time, and you're going to, through the character, you're going to feel what that character is feeling. So immediately you are there. So it's very instant and it's very important, even though we're talking about time that's long past.
right, there's an immediacy that comes through you're experiencing.
Right.
And I mean, when I read One Shot Harry, I was like, whoa, this whole part of LA existed that, of course, I wouldn't know.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was great. I love that.
Well, I would say that to Rhys' point that it is third person, but it's close third, so
Very
you
close,
tend to be in Harry's head.
Yeah.
As Harry is at this point, and it's always looking back that you sort of think about these things. It's LA in '63, so it's 2 years before what would be called the Watts riots or the Watts Rebellion, depending on your political point of view. But civil rights is on the march, even in LA. Even, by the way, at that time period, in '63, there was still housing covenants, and the chief of police, William Parker, the infamous chief of police, actively and openly recruited white officers from the Jim Crow South. He would actually advertise in papers in the South for officers to come to LA. And so it is a very interesting and volatile time period. But of course, the point being that you don't really do that. What you want to do is show this world through your character. And so Harry's just experiencing this world. It's just the world that he's living in and trying to make a living and do the best he can. But as he tries to do that, these things happen. These things are seen, but they're not necessarily pontificated upon. You don't have to stop and point a finger at it. It's just the landscape.
Well, go ahead and pontificate.
Yeah. but that's why it's all the more intense for us, because it is normal to him, and you go, well, this shouldn't be normal.
Right. That's it. Right.
And I think that, especially for those of us who write a series that it's set in historical times, you don't want to end up writing the same book. Yeah. And so you either have to find something that catches your imagination about that time and place, and that you can really develop as the core of your story that's very interesting, or you have to do a similar thing and travel them around. I mean, I cheated and did the latter. I move my characters around a lot, which allows me to find a real life person or two in each place that I can build the story around. And I find that's great, because if I choose a real life story, like the one that I wrote about San Francisco, they stumble across Dashiell Hammett. Elsewhere, they go to Japan and have an interview with the emperor in a hot bath. And,
As you do.
As you do.
As one
you
does,
do.
as one does,
Yes, you would. But it enables you to build the whole very different and yet very familiar world that you want with a historical novel.
I think that makes a lot of sense. But have you ever gotten any kind of pushback from readers at all? Like those kind of, well, I mean, I know it's kind of a softball. But, the kind of very minor, like, for example, from an Irish Studies academic perspective, one of my very good friends at Trinity is the Joyce scholar at Trinity. And he's, like myself, he's, from the States. He's a Jewish guy from Brooklyn. But he, he's just published a giant collection of footnotes to Ulysses, which is, 3 times as thick as the novel itself. But it's a whole world of people who all of a sudden will come up to you and tell you that actually, you couldn't, the lemon soap was sold out that day in 1916, right?
Oh, I can tell, I can really address that, because I get people who follow Aimée's, investigation on the Paris maps, which I conveniently supply at the front of the book. But they'll tell me, oh, I was just there, 6 weeks ago, and that's a one-way street, and she couldn't go that way. And I'm like, okay, but time out, this is, set in 1999, and it was probably that. Or the metro's not there anymore because it's being, so I get a lot of logistic issues. And so I go, that's right. And then they'll say, but I looked on Google Earth. Did you look on Google Earth in 1940? I mean, because they're like, so, I don't mean to cap on anyone, but it was very, very much that thing. So just last week I was in Paris, and I had found a building I wanted to use in my story. I looked at Google Earth and everything, and then before I got on the plane, I said, I gotta go there. So, because I believe in walking the ground, as I know everyone here does. I went there, I got off the metro, I walked down that street, and I was like, this is so not Google Earth, because I found a golden detail that goes into the story. Because I feel you have to go there. I know there's been a pandemic, but it's about walking the ground and seeing that one thing that will make this story pop. And I was so glad I did.
And you can always tell when someone hasn't been there. They'll describe Paris, and I looked across at the Eiffel Tower, and you think, no, you haven't been there, really. But another thing with historicals is the perceptions of people walking this fine line all the time between making it real to the time and not offending your audience in the present day. And I did one book set in Kenya among the white colonists in Kenya, and I actually had to write a foreword to say, you will find this repugnant. Because they, the white settlers literally treated the Africans as if they were children. And they dressed the men up in white suits and made them serve at table, when in their culture, no man would ever do housework. So you were actually emasculating every man that and that was normal for the time, and I had to show it. But so it's always this very fine line of how do I not offend too much? I've had people who write and say, I can't believe you said that awful thing about Italians, about Jews, about, and I say, no, I didn't. A woman who lived in 1903 said that.
Yeah, I think that I've stopped giving details on postage and train
And
time.
trains.
Trains,
Because
trains,
no matter, if you say that, I found this prized copy of the one of the railroad guides in Britain, and it was a reproduction. I was so happy to find it, because you could, now a lot of stuff is online, but it is at the time. So you could page through it and say, okay, if I wanted to go from Eastbourne up to Oxford, I'd go this way, and I could take this and connect there and then go there. And of course, You then get letters from people saying, not on a Tuesday, you couldn't.
That's right. That's it. That's it. That's right.
But yeah,
I worked that line. That you couldn't. That's right. Yeah.
and is that why, because this novel opens with Russell and Holmes kind of snipping a little bit over who misread the timetable for the train, in a sense.
Yeah. I think that there's probably a certain amount of that, but yeah.
Yeah, and there's, with the Joyce example, the Holy Grail is always, it's the 1906 Tom's Directory of Dublin, which is this kind of Bible of where everything was and who lived where and the phone numbers, and well, not phone numbers, and the addresses and so on. And so those fetch these absurd prices online. But yeah, I thought that was interesting. I noticed a number of you doing that in various ways, finding some means of bridging the historical moment with what's likely to be the reader's perspective. Like when Mary says something about her Republican sympathies and not knowing how far she can push them with the Queen's daughter, with the princess.
Just touching on cultural sensitivity, one of my books featured a woman from Haiti. And I had, interviewed a lot of Haitians, and she was supposedly a half-sister of Aimée Leduc. And when I interviewed people and we talked about this time, when Aimée's father would have been in Haiti and as an army guy in the 60s, I really wrote down, what was being said. And I called one of the people a mulatta because she was half black, half white. As was in literature, I started reading books at that time, and a woman told me, this is what we said, so that went in the book. 7 years later, a letter came, I think that mulatta is a racially insensitive word, and would you, and so we're like, okay, so we had the big confab, and I said, that's fine, whatever would work. And I put it back in, and the woman wrote me and said, Cara, I wasn't trying to cap on you. I just wanted you to know that it's not okay now to say that, but I understand at the time. But I like you and all that. But it was, it's hard that you have to, but it's true. You have to think about that.
Well, it is interesting. You're right, because Brian, in the book, the N word is freely used at times by the white cops who stop Harry, and sometimes when Harry's with another buddy, and it is accurate, right? It's not, so you're right, but it's interesting line. It's an interesting thing to get into. In fact, it came up in the book because I wasn't going to capitalize the term Negro, and I guess theoretically I should, right? Because certainly if you look in older stuff, it is capitalized. But then. So the trade-off was, for the modern reader, we capitalized black, but we didn't capitalize Negro. So I don't know. So there's some weird symmetry or not, but yeah.
Yeah, it's always a risk, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because things were true.
Right.
I, as a white person, would never use the N-word in a book, even though I knew it would be accurate, because I would offend too many people.
Yeah, I also DJ at Calix, the UC Berkeley station, and the only complaint I've gotten from a listener was when at the beginning of Curtis Mayfield's Don't Worry If There's a Hell Below.
Yeah, we're all going to go.
Right, yeah, and there's the N-word and various other racial epithets. And I think I muted the N-word because, on live recordings, later ones, I'd heard him skipping that part.
Oh, that's interesting.
Or not using that word.
Yeah.
And so I thought, well, it's not my judgment call to make. I'll in all things defer to Curtis.
Right.
And someone wrote in and complained that I'd censored Curtis Mayfield, or called to complain.
Yes.
And it was, with all due respect, an older white guy who was calling to complain that I had muted this artist. But I think, speaking to your point about irrespective of what the character would say, what can we as the DJ or scholar or author have that character say?
Yeah, I think they've gone way too far now, I have to say, because my editor now is so completely sensitive to anything. Like in my latest Molly Murphy book, Molly is saddled with this cook, Italian cook, who is really a terrible cook. And of course, Molly is an Irish woman who has no concept of Italian cooking and says, this food tastes awful. So I had to be, my editor said, you have to be very careful and say that this is a bad cook.
Yes, it's not that
Italian cooking is in any
awful.
way bad. You know?
That's it.
Well, I mean, I would side with her there. I mean, it's not. I'm not sure there is bad Italian food.
But then there comes to, sensitivity readers.
Yeah.
You know?
Right.
I mean, I don't know if people know about that,
Yeah,
but
oh,
a lot
yeah.
of books
Yeah.
have sensitivity readers on top of everything.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
we didn't have that when many of us started writing, you know.
Have any of you, if I can ask, gone through that process, or?
No. I mean, some might argue you probably should, but but I like to, I sort of subscribe to the Don Draper school. You know what I mean? Yes, we're going to drink in the office and we're going to smoke and we're going to have these points of view, but you at least know that these are archaic points of view. Hopefully, yeah.
I do listen to, I have a core group of readers, and I do listen to them when they catch something that they wonder if people will notice, what you don't want is for a reader to be jerked out of the continuous dream of the fiction by either an offensive word that doesn't need to be in there, or a questionable attitude, or the wrong timetable on your and so 90% of the time you can work around that. If it's not a key plot point, you can reword it, you can avoid it, you can have a different phrase that you're using instead of one that is so loaded now. It's a matter of choosing, and for those of us with long careers, looking back at the books that were published in the 90s, there's various things that I think, would I write that necessarily now? And probably not. I mean, my first published novel is about a gay cop, and I'm not gay. And the question is, would I be encouraged to write that now as a non-lesbian? The fact that it, in that series went on to win a Lambda by people who really have the right to make that decision makes me say, but they said it was. So, and I think that there is a responsibility when you are writing someone who is often dismissed. You have a responsibility of writing them as people. Right. So that when in Castle Shade, the most recent of the Russells, there are gypsies in there. Well, they were known as gypsies. They're not now. Now it's an offensive name. I can't call them travelers in 2025. I can call them Romany, which isn't terribly accurate, but it's better than just the sort of dismissive gypsy. But so long as I treat them as people, I think that the readers are more willing to allow me that questionable word if they feel that I'm treating them as...
If it's supported by a whole framework of the novel.
Yeah, if these are human beings instead of just a convenient group that steal things or have crime or whatever.
Yeah, in a way, I think it's a shame that one cannot... There are so many caveats now about writing about someone you are not, because every book we write, we're writing about someone we are not. It requires a leap of faith to get into someone else's shoes. But now, no one would dare touch writing about someone, say, of another race, or someone writing about someone who was lesbian when one is not, even though you could, you can have close friends, you can have the sensitivity, and you could do a very good job of it, but the editors wouldn't let you touch it.
I think it is good that we have been continually reminded of the need to be responsible in our writing. And I think that, occasionally when I look back at some of the early stuff, I don't tend to read my own things, except if I have to reread them.
Apologies.
But, when I do, every so often I'll find something that I'll think, that probably is offensive to somebody who's going to read it and think, oh, I'm being dismissive about them as people. I'm being rude. I'm being not understanding. And so I will occasionally write to my editor and say, would you put in your notes for the next edition that we want to change this? Obviously, you can if it's a big piece, but if it's a word that you can change and make life better for one of your readers, most publishers I think are very responsive to that.
I took a real leap of faith writing about Iranian or Persian people in this story because they factor in the story. They live in this area. They're really a big part of it. And, I really wanted to show that they're not Ayatollahs, even though the Ayatollah had lived in Paris, outside Paris and been, but France has this very complicated relationship with Iranians or Persians. And, there's been 3 successive waves to Paris. This part of Paris is called Téhéran-sur-Seine. Okay, so there's a huge group there, the ones who came in the 70s with petrodollars, very educated. They bought apartments, they put their children in the Sorbonne. Actually, the Shah of Iran met his wife, the Faradiba, in Paris, where she was studying. So there's a very cultured, sophisticated sort of elite group that were there. Then that all changed, and then people fleeing, the Ayatollah, and then the hit groups coming after the political exiles in this part. So that was really complicated, but I really felt that that people I knew were suffering all these different conditions. So I took a leap, and I said to my editor, I hope this works because I think it's really important, but if I don't get it right, let's work on it. And I think it works. But I think that's really important. You can't be afraid, and again,
That's
like
right.
Laurie said, they've got to be people who live there, who face these things. And I think I showed all different stratas,
Yeah.
hopefully.
Yeah.
But you showed them through Aimée's eyes, which makes it okay, because, you're not, we're seeing it through a different person, not through, you didn't make your protagonist one of them, which is the big difference, I think.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and I think it's something Laura was saying, I think maybe think of this, the crime fiction community of readers is so active and involved and present. And as a genre, with all the festivals, Left Coast and Bouchercon and Harrogate and all the smaller festivals, I expect that you all get a remarkable amount of interaction with and feedback from readers, more so than many peers who aren't necessarily working in a specific genre.
Well, I think that, but I think that's the point, though, Brian. You're right.
Exactly.
That the readership is also broad and varied, and yes, you get feedback, which you should. But I also say, right, that listen, man, part of this job is to write out of your skin. So I have a Japanese American character in the book. I have women characters in the book. You know what I mean? You got to be able to do it. I mean, listen, you're going to screw it up, And so maybe it is the question of having readers read it or editors take you to task or your friends take you to task, but I think you still got to want to, make that stretch. You still got to want to make that world. But you're right, but Rhys is right, that it's also, the perceptions are mostly through your character's eyes.
Yeah.
Now, occasionally I will consciously go away from that. So I have this, this one of his buddies is Josh Nakano, who's slightly older. And I'm interested in that character because it's a guy who was in World War II, and he was in the all-Japanese American Go for Broke, which was the actual unit, the 442nd. And he's seen death, and yet now he's a funeral director. And honestly, I had no idea when I made him a funeral director what I was doing. But now I realize, what does that say about this guy? That he's seen this stuff, and he's still around it, and yet he's seemingly, so what's happening with him? So I'm fascinated by that. So I'm also fascinated trying to figure out him. So listen, they're all human beings that we're just trying to put on the page, and I think if we do that, foibles and all, I think people will roll with us.
Absolutely.
Well, did I just cut you off? No. I'm mindful that we've got just over 10 minutes left, so I want to use that time to go to the audience for any questions you may have about this discussion or about anything that we haven't covered. I think someone is going to come around with a mic to this woman on the aisle here first.
Thank you so much. It's kind of been a real dream of mine to be in the same room with some of my favorite authors. And Gary, what I think you're referring to, and pretty much everybody, is the authenticity that you bring to these people. And Laurie, one of the things that I remembered in one of your books, I can't remember which one, was that you had Russell walk into a room and there's Lord Peter Wimsey sitting at the piano playing. And that
great.
just jumped right out at me, and I love the fact that, you cross-reference. So I love the fact that you obviously all are into each other's works, and I'm just so happy that you continue to write. It's really, really wonderful. Thank you for creating all these wonderful worlds for us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh,
Oh, there we go. All right. Very good. Very good.
Thanks. I'm a teacher, so I've touched all the gross stuff, so it's fine. Rhys, something you were saying about the street that you were talking about made me think about in researching for all of that.
wow, what is that?
If you want to shout, I can just repeat it if no one's
Yeah,
hearing
yeah.
it.
In researching, for all of you guys, in researching or like interviewing or talking to people, have you ever encountered a situation where people have misheard or they kind of, they don't know that you're a writer, and so they're like, why are you talking about this? Or why are you investigating this? Why are you trying to figure this out? And kind of maybe giving you weird looks or asked you, like, what are you up to kind of situation? Has that ever happened to you guys?
Well, I have been sorry.
Did everyone hear that? Okay,
Yeah,
all right.
yeah. I have sat in a restaurant with 3 friends, and someone said, well, if you want to kill someone really quickly,
That's right. It's it.
so cyanide is really the only way, isn't it? I mean, if you just want to make them go boom like
There you
that.
go, that's it.
And so we say, well, yeah, because the others, and then you talk about, and you look up, and every other table in the restaurant is like this.
Okay, well, I was at a truck stop on the road from Tucson up to Phoenix
Yeah.
with my friend Libby Hellman, and we always talk about plot when we drive
Yeah.
back and forth. So we got off at a truck stop to get gas, and we're filling up, and Libby was going, the blood spatter wouldn't look like that, Cara, I told you. And the truckers came out, whoa, they wanted to get away, so yes.
I think a lot of people have very questionable browser histories.
I was working on a heist story, and I was going down the rabbit hole of old safes, right? Mosler's an old safe company. I guess it's still around. I guess they make electronic safes now. So, of course, I call a safe company to ask a few questions about, safes and overcoming them, and then you could just hear, you know what I mean? At first it was like very enthusiastic on the other end of the line, and then you could just hear that turn, like, oh, wait a minute, I'm not answering this dude's questions, and let me get your name and number because we'll get back to you, when we call the police. So yeah.
So sometimes it's best for interviewees to make an appointment first so that they have a chance to look you up.
That's it. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah, I was once taking Val McDermott. Do you know Val McDermott?
Yeah,
She
yeah.
read serial killer books, and so she was doing a quickie tour, and I picked her up and took her along. I think she had an event in Porte de Versailles, and I took her out to look at the gun emplacements and things down on the Marin Headlands. And we're walking there, and there's these huge iron rings that are on the wall that you use to adjust the guns. And she looked at them and she said, wow, what a serial killer could do with those rings. And these 3 teenage girls behind us turned really fast and left.
I assume that sounded more threatening in a Scottish accent, too.
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
I think you had a question, too?
I'll just project.
Yeah.
I'm actually curious, I know in doing all your research in historical environments, I'm guessing you probably were looking at photographs, looking at newspaper clippings, all that. Is there any little tidbit that you guys have found that maybe wouldn't go in a story, but just jumped out at you as like, oh my God, this is so cool. Just like a little snip in a newspaper or a cool photo or something.
I have to share the latest Molly book. I'm now writing with my daughter, and she is reading the New York Times for every day that we're writing about. And she came across this, in those days, journalism, now we're taught the facts. Journalism in those days was very florid, very colorful. And she found this little tiny piece about this man who was was taken to court for alienation of affection of his wife. and the man apparently he'd fathered 26 children.
Wow.
And he said, as he twirls his luxuriant moustaches, he couldn't help commenting that it was not his fault. He was so much more attractive than the woman's husband. And so, we had to somehow slip this into the book because it was so really good.
It's a terrific line.
Yeah, I think that most of the things that you come across, you do manage to fit in there. Maybe not in the detail that you want, but the Baedeker's guidebooks for the teens and 20s are so fabulous with the detail. I mean, they're not just 21st century guidebooks of where to find a museum and when it's open. The divans of the guest house are infested with fleas. You know that guy slept at that guest house. And coming across things like a reference to salt smuggling. And I thought, I gotta have a salt smuggler.
That's
so,
great.
You kind of make a note of that. And salt smuggling has nothing to do with the plot.
Right.
But you need somebody to sort of walk in and sort of offer
Absolutely.
them information. I thought, there's my salt smuggler.
Like, want to buy some salt?
Yeah, that's great.
And those little bits add so much rich. There's that
richness, yeah.
HBO series Barry that is on right now, and there was this wonderful moment in the last episode, without giving anything away, where someone is fleeing from Barry, and then all of a sudden it cuts to a discussion inside between a couple, two women that are breaking up. And then you just see this parade of dogs running by in the back. It's completely gratuitous, has nothing to do with the plot, and then you see the person fleeing, getting chased by the dogs, and then you hear the reason they're breaking up is because one of the women has too many dogs. And it's completely excessive, but it still adds to the texture of what you're watching.
I found a footnote in a history book about 7 years ago, and it said that when the Germans took over Paris, Adolf Hitler came for 3 hours, and then he left, never to return. And I went, why? The city was his. What's going on? And I could not let that go. That what if, and then I found all these newsreels, which you can see on YouTube, of him visiting with these two men, and later in the book it says the two men who were with him, who were seen in the newsreels, one said they came on June 23rd, and the other one said they came on June 28th. And I said, that's my story, right? There's something there. And so, but what you're saying is that I didn't use it right away. It took me like 7 years to write that story, but there's something that happened. And sometimes it's just like you have tons of notebooks, or at least I have tons of notebooks, and then I'll, what was that thing I was thinking of that happened here? And you can pull that out, so.
I think we have time for maybe one more question.
There's a gentleman back there.
Oh, maybe two if they're short.
I can't hear.
You can repeat it.
I'll repeat it.
Yeah.
So, for instance, Bangkok Library, the Asian Library on campus has put on an enormous amount of data. They use correspondence, letters, everything you could possibly imagine. How is the digitalization of all the archives changed your research?
I think the short version is, how's the digital availability of archives and research resources changed your experience? I know you, Laurie, had to do a lot of the research for this online.
Yeah, it hugely. Certainly during the last 2 years, when those of us who write travel books couldn't travel. But even 12, 15 years ago, the most you could hope for on online searches was to find somebody who did know, or to find a little museum in England that had this. But now you can drown in the stuff. But it is extremely valuable,
But still, all said and done, it really doesn't beat, as Cara said, going to the place It also doesn't beat if you can find somebody in that research who was there or who lives there now or knows, and you talk to that person, man, it's invaluable. Just the little tidbits, the little asides that you can't even necessarily get from those letters and what all that data is. So the more you can, as we were sort of talking about earlier, the more you can inhabit those little kernels, those little asides that only somebody who has been there or has gone through there knows, and you can, salt that into the work.
Yeah.
I just think it's so much the better.
Well, I heard last time that only 4% of the French archives have been digitized. 4%.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that hasn't as
Right.
well.
Yeah.
But if you.
Yeah, and also the internet can proliferate misinformation
That's
too.
correct.
You get
Yeah.
one small fact and it gets passed from site to site
That's
to
right.
site. So
That's
you always have to
exact-
double check.
That's right. I cannot emphasize that more. I can't even remember what the heck it was. I was doing something for the next One Shot Harry, and I read this thing online, and something in the back of my head said that can't be right. So I go to another side, read it. Sure enough, though, I go to a book, ladies and gentlemen, and damn it, the book was right.
And I think that's all the time we have. So please join me in thanking the authors. Remember,
Thank you, Brian.